In the middle of a glittering ballroom, a cruel voice rang out, "You don't belong here." It was a moment meant to break a woman, but instead, it broke open the truth. Before I share this powerful story with you, please subscribe and comment where you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Because this isn't just a story, it's a mirror held up to society. Now let's begin. The chandeliers dripped golden light across the cavernous ballroom, a place so polished it almost mocked those who had never belonged within its walls. Crystal glasses chimed faintly as servers in black uniforms weaved between clusters of millionaires and billionaires, men in tuxedos and women in gowns worth the cost of a family's home. At the farthest corner of the room, Alana steadied a silver tray against her shoulder, her eyes fixed on the glistening floor. She knew better than to make eye contact here. She knew better than to linger. Her shift had begun with a whispered warning from the banquet manager. Smile, but not too wide. Be invisible, but not absent. And whatever you do, don't cause a scene. It was the same reminder she had heard at every upscale event. Words that carried the unspoken edge of who she was. A black woman serving the wealthy elite. She bent her posture just enough to avoid brushing against a guest's sequin sleeve, then pivoted between a circle of laughing men who barely noticed her presence. But as she passed, one of them, ruddy-faced, his drink already tipping past sobriety, threw an arm back in an exaggerated gesture of storytelling. His elbow struck the tray. The champagne flutes rattled, tilted, and in one breathless instant, a golden stream cascaded down the back of a woman's dress. Gasps sliced through the conversation like knives. The woman shrieked, twisting as the expensive silk darkened. The man responsible stumbled, his words slurring. Oh hell, that wasn't me. She wasn't watching where she was going. And just like that, eyes darted toward Alana. She froze, tray still trembling in her hands. The champagne glasses, 2 shattered, 3 intact, lay like evidence at her feet. She wanted to speak, to correct the lie, but the woman's voice drowned her out. Can't you people ever be careful? You people. The phrase knifed through her chest. Heat swelled across her face, but Alana forced herself into stillness. Training had taught her to swallow pride, to apologize even when innocence was hers. But in that moment, the room's collective stare felt heavier than any weight she had carried. Billionaire guests leaned back with thin smiles, already forming judgments. To them, she wasn't Alana, the woman who had worked 3 jobs to keep her mother's lights on, the woman who read novels on bus rides home to escape fatigue. To them, she was simply the waitress who spilled the drink. The banquet manager swooped in, voice dripping false cheer. So sorry, madam, we'll handle this at once. He shot Alana a glance sharp enough to draw blood. Without words, it told her, you'll take the fall for this. On instinct, she bent to collect the shards, each piece slicing faintly against her glove. The laughter around her grew brittle, a cruel symphony of wealth amused by another's humiliation. She swallowed hard, her throat thick. This wasn't the first time she had been wrongly blamed in these gilded halls. Microaggressions were stitched into every corner of this world. The patrons who refused her hand when she offered a plate, the whispered she's surprisingly articulate when she dared to greet them, the wary eyes that followed her as if waiting for her to slip, to fail. But tonight, the sting was different, more public, more brutal. The words "you people" still rang in her ears as though the entire ballroom had joined the accusation. When she rose again, tray nearly empty, she caught sight of a boy at the edge of the dance floor. A young man, his frame awkward against the grandeur of the space. His hands clutched the wheels of his chair with a quiet intensity, his face half hidden in shadow. Unlike the others, he wasn't staring at her with scorn. His gaze was softer, curious, almost wounded, as though he understood what it felt like to be put on display for the wrong reasons. Alana's chest tightened. She turned away quickly, retreating into the corner as the manager hissed in her ear, "Don't let it happen again, or you're done." Her dignity felt as shattered as the glass she had picked from the floor. Still, she forced her body back into motion. Trays had to be filled. Drinks had to be poured. No one here cared for her story, for her truth. To them, she was only a servant in a room of power. But in the quiet space between humiliation and survival, Alana couldn't shake the memory of the boy's eyes. Clear, unflinching, almost pleading. For the first time that evening, she realized she wasn't the only one suffocating under the gaze of this cruel, glittering crowd. And though she didn't know it yet, that single connection, one bruised black waitress, one overlooked disabled heir, would soon ignite the kind of fire no chandelier could smother. The gala pulsed with opulence. Strings hummed from the quartet in the corner. Champagne continued to flow, and the humiliation Alana had endured moments earlier dissolved into the background chatter of people too privileged to care. Yet for her, the sting still lingered, echoing in her body like the aftertaste of something bitter. She moved swiftly between tables, refilling glasses, her smile stitched across her face like a mask. But beneath it, her thoughts churned. You people. The words looped in her mind, dragging her into the deep waters of memory. The times she'd been followed in stores as though she were a thief, the teachers who had mistaken her quiet for ignorance, the managers who had praised her pleasant attitude instead of her skill. It was always the same story, never fully seen, never given the dignity of being whole. And then her eyes found him again. The young man in the wheelchair sat half in the shadows, positioned near the edge of the dance floor. The rest of the ballroom had forgotten him, absorbed in its rituals of power. His peers danced without him, their laughter sharp and loud, their movements tinged with the kind of arrogance that came from knowing the world bent to their desires. But he remained apart, his hands idle on the wheels, his lips pressed tight, as though swallowing words he longed to release. Alana noticed how the waitstaff, too, avoided his gaze. Not out of cruelty, but out of the unspoken rule that guests like him, the disabled, the overlooked, were not to be acknowledged beyond necessity. The irony struck her. Here she was, a black woman forced into invisibility. And there he was, a disabled heir erased in plain sight. Two kinds of exclusion dressed differently, but cut from the same cruel cloth. Something in her chest stirred. She took a risk. On her next pass, with a tray of sparkling cider, she slowed, lowering herself slightly so that her eyes aligned with his. "Would you like one?" she asked gently, her voice softened but clear. For a second, he blinked in surprise. No one had spoken to him since the speeches ended. His hand hesitated, then reached for the glass. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch, but one that carried the charge of recognition. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice low, almost unsure of its place. Alana nodded. "You're welcome." She should have moved on immediately. Her manager was already watching her like a hawk, but she lingered, compelled by the sadness resting behind his eyes. The boy Carter, though she didn't yet know his name, glanced toward the dancers and then back at her. There was something unspoken in his gaze, something raw, the kind of look she knew too well, the look of someone who had been placed outside the circle of belonging, forced to watch joy from the margins. The quartet shifted into a waltz, its rhythm flowing like a river across the polished floor. Couples glided in synchrony, gowns spinning like colored tides. Carter's jaw tightened. His fingers tapped faintly against the rim of his chair, following the rhythm he could not join. Alana's chest ached. She remembered her younger brother, who had once loved to dance in their living room before the accident that had left him struggling to walk. She remembered holding his hands, guiding his trembling steps, whispering, "You can still move. You can still be part of the music." An idea sparked. Dangerous, perhaps even reckless in this space, but irresistible. She leaned closer, her voice almost conspiratorial. "You know," she said softly, "the floor belongs to anyone brave enough to step onto it." His brows furrowed. For a moment, he thought she was mocking him, but the sincerity in her eyes dissolved the suspicion. He let out a breath, half laugh, half scoff. "Not me," he whispered, bitterness lacing the words. "Especially you," Alana replied, her tone firm yet warm. Their eyes locked. Around them, laughter and gossip swirled, but for a brief second the entire ballroom seemed to narrow to a single, fragile connection between two people society had marked as lesser. A nearby woman noticed them, her painted lips twisting in disdain. She leaned toward her companion, whispering loud enough for Alana to hear. "Look at her. Flirting for tips, probably." The words sliced sharp, a reminder of the risk she was taking. Alana's spine stiffened, but she didn't back away. She gave Carter one last look of encouragement before rising to her full height and drifting back into the crowd. Trey balanced like armor. From his chair, Carter watched her retreat. His heart thudded with something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not shame, but a strange flicker of possibility. For the first time that night, he didn't feel entirely invisible. And for Alana, though her humiliation still burned, she carried with her the fragile sense that she had passed a spark into hands that might one day strike a flame. The night would not let them rest. Soon, that spark would blaze into something far larger than either of them could imagine. The music shifted again. The quartet's melody grew fuller, violins weaving into the pulse of the piano, the kind of rhythm meant to summon bodies to the floor in synchronized elegance. Couples drifted forward, their gowns and tuxedos gliding like waves under the chandelier's glare. The floor shone, polished to a mirror's sheen, reflecting the privilege of those who believed themselves entitled to its center. Carter sat on the edge, his wheelchair locked in place, hands gripping the metal rims so tightly his knuckles blanched. His eyes followed the dancers with an expression he tried to mask as indifference. But his fingers betrayed him. They twitched faintly, tapping out the rhythm he couldn't escape. From across the room, Alana saw him. She had been carrying another tray, pretending not to hear the whispers still echoing about the earlier spill. She had learned long ago that survival in spaces like this meant becoming part of the wallpaper. Silent, invisible, disposable. Yet something in Carter's isolation pulled at her, the way a quiet chord resonates beneath louder music. She remembered her own humiliation, still raw, and recognized the same weight pressing on him. Different, yes, but familiar in the way it crushed dignity. Her heart pounded. She should keep working. Her manager had already warned her once, but as her eyes locked with Carter's across the polished floor, the thought came unbidden. If not me, then who? Without another moment's hesitation, she set the tray on a side table. Ignoring the heat of disapproving stares, she walked straight toward him. The crowd parted reluctantly, confused murmurs trailing behind her. What was the waitress doing? Why was she approaching the billionaire's son as though they were equals? She knelt slightly, her voice steady but gentle. "Would you like to dance?" Carter froze. For a heartbeat, he wondered if she was mocking him, like the cruel classmates who once pretended to invite him into games only to laugh when he tried. But then he saw the earnestness in her face, the absence of pity, the presence of something stronger, defiance. His lips parted, forming words he'd never dared to say aloud in this setting. "I can't." Alana smiled softly. "You can. You just need someone to follow your lead." Something cracked inside him, a fragile wall he had built against years of exclusion. His breath shuddered, but before he could protest again, Alana gently extended her hand. The ballroom stilled, the music swelling against the sudden hush. Carter reached out. Their hands touched, and then, slowly, Alana began to move. She guided the wheels of his chair with a subtle rhythm, her body swaying in synchrony with the music. But she didn't lead. She let him push first, following his hesitant motions as though every turn of the wheel was an intentional step. He blinked, startled, then leaned into the moment, his arms pushing forward, backward, spinning the chair slightly. Alana spun with him, twirling as if his movement had commanded it. Gasps rippled across the room. The elite dancers faltered, their polished routine interrupted by the audacity of what they were witnessing. A black waitress and a disabled heir claiming the floor meant only for them. Whispers sharpened into words. What is she doing? Doesn't she know her place? This is obscene. One woman clutched her pearls dramatically, while a man in a corner sneered, muttering about making a spectacle. Yet despite the venom in their voices, no one could look away. The music was still playing, and in its rhythm, Alana and Carter carved out a pocket of joy, so pure it shattered decorum. Carter's face transformed. The bitterness that had weighed on him melted into something lighter, freer. For the first time in years, he wasn't the disabled boy hidden in the shadows of wealth. He was a dancer, a leader, a young man whose presence demanded recognition. Alana felt the shift in him, and her own chest swelled. Every eye that condemned her only fueled her resolve. Let them whisper. Let them frown. Tonight, she wasn't a servant cowering beneath insult. She was a woman daring to claim humanity for herself and for him. At the edge of the floor, Richard, the billionaire father, watched. His face was unreadable, torn between anger and something he hadn't expected to feel: awe. He had spent years protecting his son from ridicule by hiding him away, by keeping him at the edges of society's gatherings. He had told himself it was love, but seeing Carter now alive, commanding, radiant, he realized it had been fear. And the person who had unlocked that truth was not him, but the black waitress whose dignity had been stepped on only minutes ago. The dance lasted less than 3 minutes, but to those watching, it stretched into eternity. Every spin of the wheelchair, every sway of Alana's body, was an act of rebellion against the rigid hierarchies in the room. When the music ended, silence crushed the air. No applause, no polite acknowledgement, just a stunned, seething quiet. Then came the sharp voice of a man from the crowd. Disgraceful. The spell broke. Guests began muttering furiously, some demanding to know why the staff allowed such impropriety. A few young people snickered, mocking Carter for daring to think himself equal. And in the corner, Alana's manager strode forward, his face thunderous, ready to drag her away. But Carter lifted his chin, defiance etched into every line of his face. For once, he didn't care about their judgment. He had danced. He had led. And no amount of scorn could erase that. Alana straightened beside him, meeting the hostile stares head-on. The humiliation she had felt earlier had transformed into something else entirely. Strength forged in fire. She knew the consequences were coming, but she also knew this: the floor they had just claimed could never be fully taken back. And deep inside the crowd, Richard's heart pounded. He was no longer simply watching his son. He was watching a mirror held up to his own cowardice, and he could not look away. The silence that followed the dance was heavier than applause could ever have been. It clung to the chandelier-lit air, a thick blanket of judgment and disbelief. The quartet faltered, bowstrings hesitating over strings, unsure whether to continue or cut the music short. And then, as though a cue had been given, the whispers began. They slithered through the ballroom like smoke. She's out of line. Unprofessional. Shameless. Imagine the nerve, letting him make a fool of himself like that. Alana could feel every word pierce her skin. The laughter from earlier, when she had been blamed for the spilled champagne, was cruel. Yes, but this was different. This was venom, sharpened by the outrage of people who believed their order had been disrupted, their hierarchy threatened. Her manager stormed across the room, face red, jaw clenched. He reached her and hissed through gritted teeth. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? You've embarrassed this entire event." Alana's body stiffened, but she didn't flinch. Behind her, Carter sat tall in his chair, still catching his breath, his expression lit with something his father had never seen before: pride. The manager turned toward the guests, hands raised in appeasement. "Please, everyone, forgive this momentary lapse in professionalism. She'll be removed immediately." Removed. As if she were trash. 2 servers moved forward, uncertain but obedient, ready to escort her away. Carter's voice cut through the chaos. "Don't touch her." The words were quiet, but they rang with a clarity that froze the servers mid-step. Carter's eyes were blazing, his hand gripping the armrest of his chair. "She didn't embarrass me. She gave me something none of you ever have: respect." Gasps fluttered across the room. A few guests looked away, ashamed. Others scoffed openly, muttering about ingratitude. Alana's throat tightened. In all the years she had endured humiliation in silence, no one had ever stood up for her. That it came from him, this young man society pitted but never truly saw, was almost unbearable in its tenderness. Richard, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt his chest constrict. His son's voice was stronger than he had ever heard it. For so long, Richard had convinced himself Carter was fragile, too vulnerable for confrontation, too dependent to face cruelty head-on. But here he was, publicly defending a woman who had been treated as disposable. The whispers grew sharper. One woman in emerald silk leaned toward her husband, her voice a harsh hiss. She's manipulating him. Can't you see? Playing the victim for attention. Her words cut through Alana like glass. She wanted to shout, to remind them of the truth, that she hadn't spilled the drink, that she hadn't asked for their scorn, that she hadn't been performing for pity, but for humanity. But the weight of so many eyes pressed down on her, smothering her voice. Her hands trembled. For a brief moment, she thought she might cry. But then she caught Carter's gaze, steady, unyielding, and steadied herself. If he could withstand their ridicule, so could she. The quartet resumed awkwardly, filling the air with forced elegance. Guests turned their backs, pretending the disruption had never happened, though their whispers never ceased. Alana was told to step into the back, out of sight. The manager spat threats of termination under his breath, but she barely heard him. In the shadows near the kitchen door, she leaned against the wall, breath shallow, hands gripping her apron. Humiliation coursed through her veins, but beneath it was something else, an ember of resistance that had not existed before tonight. She had seen Carter's joy. She had felt his pride. And she had seen the way Richard had looked at them both, his mask of indifference cracking. Back in the ballroom, Richard remained still. His colleagues approached him, murmuring about control, reputation, allowing staff to overstep. One man clapped him on the shoulder, laughing cruelly. "Don't worry, Rich. The help gets ideas sometimes. You'll fire her and move on." But Richard didn't laugh. His eyes lingered on the empty corner, where Alana had disappeared. He thought of the way she had placed herself in the fire without hesitation, not for herself, but for Carter. He thought of the way Carter's shoulders had squared, the life in his voice when he defended her. It unsettled him, cut deeper than he wanted to admit. For years, Richard had accepted the unspoken rules of these rooms. He had tolerated the snide remarks, the elitist cruelty, the subtle racism cloaked as etiquette, because it was easier than confrontation. He had thought himself powerful, yet now he saw how easily he had bowed to the same forces that had crushed his son and humiliated Alana. Tonight, he realized, power was not in the chandeliers or the bank accounts. Power was in the courage to stand where others demanded you kneel. And though he wasn't ready to admit it aloud, he knew the reckoning would come. The ballroom carried on, but the air was fractured. Laughter sounded thinner, forced, every chuckle masking discomfort. Waiters glided between tables with trays, but their steps faltered under the thick current of unease. The incident still pulsed at the edges of conversation, whispered behind raised glasses, smoothed over with brittle smiles. Alana had been sent to the back, yet she could still feel their voices reaching for her, like claws scratching at the edges of her dignity. She stood by the service door, staring at the tiled wall, her chest tight. The manager had barked, "Stay out of sight until I figure out how to deal with you," as if her humanity were a logistical inconvenience. But hiding did not make her invisible. Not truly. Two women slipped into the hallway to powder their noses. They saw Alana there and sneered openly, as though she were a stain on the wallpaper. One leaned in, her perfume thick, her whisper loud enough to be deliberate. "I told you." She did it for attention. That kind of girl always does. That kind of girl. Alana clenched her jaw, her nails biting into her palms. She wanted to shout back, to strip away the veneer of their cruelty, but she forced herself to stay silent. Silence had been her shield for so long. Yet now, after what she had shared with Carter on the floor, it felt like a prison. She turned to leave, but two men blocked her way. Guests, their ties loosened, wine glasses in hand. Their smirks told her they weren't here to ask for a refill. "Hey," one said, voice dripping with mockery. "Quite a show you put on out there. Didn't know this was that kind of party." His companion laughed. "You must be proud of yourself, getting all that attention. Dancing with the boy like you were trying out for some charity ad." Alana's stomach turned. She tried to step past them, but the first man slid into her path. His eyes narrowed. "Know your place, sweetheart. People like us don't come here to watch people like you play pretend." The words cracked something inside her. The memory of broken glass on the ballroom floor. The sting of you people. And now this. an attempt not just to humiliate her, but to erase her completely. Before she could respond, a voice rang out, "Move." Carter's chair rolled into the hallway, his wheels spinning with purpose. His face was flushed, his voice unshakable. "You heard me. Move." The men turned, startled. One snorted, "Relax, kid. We're just talking." "No," Carter said, his voice rising. "You're trying to break her down, just like you've tried to break me down my entire life. I won't let you." The hallway went silent. The two men exchanged glances, then chuckled, dismissing him. "Look," one muttered. "He thinks he's the hero now." But Carter didn't flinch. He spun his chair forward, positioning himself between Alana and the men. His voice thundered louder than the quartet inside. "She showed me I'm not invisible. She gave me more respect in 3 minutes than you've ever given anyone. You don't get to take that away from her." Alana's throat tightened. She had been fighting tears all night, but now they threatened to spill for an entirely different reason. No one had ever defended her like this. Certainly not in front of the very people who thrived on tearing her down. The men hesitated, uncertain now. Their swagger faltered in the face of Carter's fire. Then another voice cut through, steady, resonant, impossible to ignore. "Enough." Richard stepped into the hallway, his presence commanding, his tailored suit glinting under the light. But there was no arrogance in his face now, only resolve. The men straightened immediately. "Richard, we were just—" "I know what you were doing," he interrupted, his voice sharp as glass. His eyes burned into them. "I've watched all night, while people like you mocked my son and humiliated this woman. And I said nothing. That ends now." The words fell heavy. For a man like Richard, who had built his empire on reputation, who had always avoided conflict in these social circles, to speak this way was unthinkable. The men shifted uneasily. "Come on, Rich, don't make a scene. She's staff. You'll fire her, and we'll forget this." "No," Richard said, stepping closer. His gaze shifted to Alana, and for the first time, his eyes softened. "She gave my son something priceless. Dignity, joy, courage. If anyone here should be ashamed, it's us, for letting cruelty pass as etiquette, for letting prejudice masquerade as order." Alana's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to speak for her. Not here. Not ever. Inside the ballroom, conversations faltered as Richard's voice carried through the open doorway. Guests turned, drawn by the spectacle of a man who had always been one of them, now turning against them. Carter straightened in his chair, his pride glowing. Alana stood frozen, caught between disbelief and relief. The masks were breaking. The lies of civility that had hidden their cruelty were crumbling under the weight of truth. Richard's jaw tightened. "If you have a problem with her, with my son, or with the fact that they dared to claim the floor that belongs to everyone, then your problem is with me." The two men stammered, then melted back into the crowd, their bravado dissolved. For the first time that night, Alana felt the balance of power shift. Not entirely, not permanently, but enough to know that the cracks were spreading. And in those cracks, something new was about to rise. The ballroom seemed to tremble under the weight of silence. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, their brilliance suddenly harsh, as if illuminating every secret, every mask, every whispered cruelty that had been allowed to flourish. All eyes were fixed on Richard. He stepped forward, leaving the hallway behind. Each stride across the polished floor resounded like a gavel striking wood. His reputation had always been his armor, but tonight it was his weapon. Guests parted reluctantly, clearing a path as though they sensed that history was about to be carved into the marrow of this night. Alana followed behind, hesitant but compelled, her pulse hammering. Carter wheeled beside his father, his presence a living defiance. When they reached the center, Richard turned to face the crowd. For years, he had been their equal, their ally, their mirror. Tonight, he would become their accuser. "I've been a coward," he began, his voice carrying, steady and grave. "I built my life in rooms like this, rooms where cruelty hides behind laughter, where exclusion parades as tradition, where silence is mistaken for civility. I stood by while my son was diminished, while a woman was shamed, because I thought protecting my standing mattered more than protecting the truth. A murmur rippled through the guests, shock colliding with indignation. But Richard did not falter. His gaze swept over the room, pinning them in place. "My son Carter," he continued, placing a hand on the back of the wheelchair, "has endured your whispers, your pity, your cruelty. Yet tonight, he showed more courage on this floor than any of you hiding behind your champagne glasses." Carter's face flushed, not with shame but with pride. Richard's eyes shifted to Alana, and she. His voice thickened, the words deliberate. "She carried herself with grace when you tried to strip her dignity. She gave my son a gift none of your money, none of your influence, could ever give him: the freedom to feel seen, the freedom to belong." Gasps scattered through the crowd. Some looked away ashamed. Others bristled, their masks of superiority slipping into sneers. One of the men from the hallway tried to speak. "Richard, you're making too much of this." Richard's hand cut through the air, silencing him. "No. What's too much is the centuries of silence, the centuries of women like her being forced to lower their heads, while people like us congratulated ourselves on refinement. What's too much is my son being told he is less, because he moves differently. What's too much is thinking that cruelty is acceptable if it's dressed in silk and smiles." His voice thundered now, filling every corner of the ballroom. "Tonight, I will not be silent. Tonight, I stand with them." The weight of his declaration slammed into the crowd. The orchestra stopped mid-note, the violins hanging in midair, as though the music itself refused to compete. Alana's knees threatened to give way. She had dreamt of moments like this, of someone powerful refusing to let injustice slide. But dreams always felt too far, too fragile. Now, in the gleam of crystal light, it was real. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't disposable. Carter rolled forward. His voice was smaller than his father's, but no less powerful. "You tried to shame us, but shame belongs to you, not us." The ballroom seemed to exhale. People shifted uncomfortably, unable to escape the mirror being held up to them. Richard reached for Alana's hand, guiding her gently forward. "If anyone here doubts her worth, if anyone here thinks this floor does not belong to her, then let them say it now." Silence. Utter silence. No one dared. Because for the first time, the tide had turned. The woman they had tried to humiliate stood tall in the center of their grandeur, her chin lifted, her hand clasped by the very man whose silence once sentenced her to invisibility. And his son, once dismissed as fragile, looked every bit the flame that had ignited the reckoning. The two men who had cornered her shrank back toward the edges of the room, their confidence stripped. Their wives looked at them with thin-lipped disdain, sensing that their smugness had curdled into shame. Richard released Alana's hand only to raise it, high, as though presenting her to the world. "This woman is not staff. She is not an inconvenience. She is not what your prejudice names her. She is a reminder that dignity does not come from where you sit or how much you own. It comes from how you treat those you believe cannot fight back." The words cracked like a whip, leaving a sting in their wake. Some clapped hesitantly, others followed, and soon a smattering of applause filled the air. Not all genuine, but enough to fracture the false unity of the crowd. Enough to prove that the old order had been rattled. Alana's eyes blurred with tears, but her back remained unbowed. Tonight, she was not a shadow. Tonight she was seen. Carter grinned, a spark of triumph breaking through years of quiet endurance. Richard stood firm, shoulders squared. For once, he wasn't a businessman, a social figure, or a strategist. He was simply a man who chose truth over comfort. The reckoning had come, not with riots or fists, but with words that tore the veil of civility apart. And though the night would end, though gossip would ripple through their circles for weeks, nothing could erase what had been claimed here. On this floor, dignity had been reclaimed, and no chandelier, no whisper, no mask could dim it again. Thank you for watching, but ask yourself this. What would you have done if you were standing in that ballroom tonight? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken up? Stories like this reveal the truths we often ignore. If you believe dignity deserves a voice, hit that subscribe button now, because the next story will shake you even deeper than this one.